who's a professional wetland scientist. He's also a geologist, and he works at a place called Power Engineering, and he's been doing wetlands work for many years, and he kindly agreed to take us on a virtual field trip. So I'm going to have him say hello and give you a quick overview of what it is that we're hoping to see today.
Hi there, class. It's a brisk March day here, almost the beginning of April, and actually seeing some buds on some willow trees, and some of the wetland species, of course. And so what we're doing today is we're going to take you on a virtual field trip of Maine Wetlands Bank, which has been in existence for close to 20 years now. And here are about 6 different phases, which you'll see as a map later as a handout. So just some lay of the land features. We're in the headwaters of Long Creek, and a tributary that flows through Maine Wetlands Bank, a perennial tributary, is Blanchette Brook. So we'll be taking peeks along the way at Blanchette Brook, and also some of these original phases of the bank. And then we'll wrap up on the 6th phase, which was undertaken for the Portland Jet Port 10 years or so ago. And this is the 10th year of monitoring, and we'll be looking at some of the details of that.
Okay, so maybe you can point out on the map where...
So we are right here now, and we are looking that way. And what we're going to do on this video field trip is travel down County Road, come in, we'll see an early part of Maine Wetlands Bank. You will have a far better illustration of this maps, but this was the first phase of Maine Wetlands Bank, and we will travel through these 2 industrial parks to the most recent phase, which is located right here. And so for perspective, we are in the headwaters of Long Creek, Blanchette Brook, a tributary to Long Creek, on the west side of the Maine Turnpike, and that stream sort of runs like this into this large detention stormwater management pond. You can see the stream course, and then the natural stream course is the blue line that heads out and flows under Spring Street. And we will also look at where it flows through the Colonel Westbrook Business Park.
Okay, sounds great.
Started in 2000. And so there's, very dense vegetation here. Gray birch in the foreground, and we see some, cattail. There's some willow in there, but there's actually a mistake here, and you see the tall saplings. Those are actually an alder, but it's European alder, which has been identified as an invasive species.
And wasn't that commonly used in the early days in these projects?
Yeah, as a mistake. It's very similar to Alnus incana or Alnus rugosa, and it was, planted unintentionally, but subsequent to this, when it became recognized as an invasive species, it was prohibited to be planted, and if planted, needed to be removed. But this occurrence preceded that, and it's been allowed to stay in place.
Interesting. So I'm just going to zoom in so the students can see what this looks like. It's this, so alder, you all might remember alders, and as Cole said, we have some native alders here, but this one is a different species that's not actually native to Maine, and you can see it grows very tall and straight, almost like a tree, instead of our native species, which are more shrubby looking. So here we are again, and just a quick picture of this sign that was installed when this part of the project went in, this phase. And Cole was just explaining to me that the piece that we just looked at was one of the earlier phases, and now this phase was later. You can see the vegetation looks different.
So what we're looking at here is actually the second phase of Maine Wetlands Bank. It was undertaken for the Maine Department of Transportation. They were doing a ramp improvement on I-295, and what's sort of very significant about this is, and Pam will pan behind her after this, but there was a steel warehouse on this lot that had to be removed. It was in violation of a federal permit with the Corps of Engineers, and so it was actually removed prior to this becoming wetland compensation.
Let me just zoom in. I think hopefully you can see in the back, it's a nice marsh surrounded by shrub. Looks like a lot of alder, and
there's actually some mallards out there sitting on a muskrat house.
Nice. I don't know if you guys can see, but there's a mallard swimming around in there. And as Cole said, it was sitting on a muskrat house. So there's definitely wildlife use at the site. So Cole was just telling me, see this building here, that's similar to the building that had to be removed. It was built on fill. So when they restored the wetland here, they had to remove the building and all the fill before they restored the wetland.
And what that did was it reestablished the hydrology so that proper soils could be installed. And you know, those are two criteria of wetland, of course. And what then was done was plant hydrophytic wetland vegetation to complete the three parameters and restore the wetland. So we are right here right now, and we're going to take a peek at the brook here in a moment. But in terms of what we've just looked at, we started down here. This is where Pam was talking about the alder. And then we came to the corner. This is where the sign was. This was the second phase, work done for Department of Transportation. The mallard was nesting right here in the cattail. And so we simply walked around the building and we're right here. And so this was one of the more recent phases of wetland restoration here at Maine Wetlands Bank. And this outline, this rectangle, was the original stormwater management pond for the two subdivisions. And I like to think of it as kind of being like just a plain old dumb sheet cake pan. It was excavated in the path of the former brook. There's a weir down here to control flood flow, but it wasn't very natural. So one of the forms of restoration we did was to reestablish this serpentine channel, more natural in configuration. It used to go from input to output, a straight line. So we imposed some stream characteristics. And then in addition, these areas are ponds that have infiltration beneath them and a pipe network that actually outfalls downstream. And the purpose of those ponds was to allow overbank flooding in high stage of the stream to collect the water and its potential contaminants, and then infiltrate through special soil composition into the pipe network and discharge improved water quality downstream. In addition to that improvement of removal of toxicants and sediments, by being subsurface, it also took care of thermal pollution from these paved parking lots, and made water temperatures cooler when returning to the stream.
So, and I'm just gonna show you guys what where we're standing, and you can see there is certainly impervious surface all around this area. And so here's the stream. You can see it's gone under the ground, and now it's coming out here in a couple of spots and heading down into this area that Cole just showed us on the map.
So as Pam mentioned, we're at the downstream end of this stormwater management basin, basically right here. And Pam will show you over her shoulder where the stream leaves the basin through a reinforced concrete pipe. And so this was a segment of stream that we reconfigured into the serpentine fashion that you see here on meander, would be the more proper word, on the map. And the brook is, we had a heavy rain a day or so ago. The brook is probably 12 inches deep, 3 feet wide, a silty clay bottom. It's what's called scantic soils here. That's the native soil, but it's more natural than it used to be, as just sort of a dumb straight ditch through a big flat pond, this basin.
So that completes the background tour, and you've seen now many of the different restored sites that are part of this Maine wetlands bank. We've seen the early phase, the next phase, and then we went over and spent a little time looking at number 5 here, where the meandering brook is. And now finally, we're over at number 6 on this site map, which is the part of the restoration bank that you are going to be focusing on for your lab. And so now we'll turn it back to Cole, and we'll walk through this site and give you a little background information on it. So before we head into the site, let's just take a quick look at the as-built plan for this part of the Maine Wetlands Bank. And you can see here on the map that there's an area that's been created here to the left, and the blue line represents the pools, and the swale right here is one of the pools that they created. And then there's a planting list, and let's just blow that up so we can take a look at it. There's many plants that were planted here, everything trees and shrubs. Also in the pools themselves, they planted some wetland obligate species like pickerelweed and burrweed and arrowhead, which should be familiar to all of you. And so you can see the names of the plants, how many they planted, and the size. And then they also used a wetland mix, which they seeded at the site. And here's the list of plants that are included in the wetland mix. Again, some of these are probably familiar to you. All right, so now let's hear what Cole has to say and see if we can find some of these species on our walk. We're going to talk about plants for a minute.
So, as you see on the plan, I think close to 1,000 plants, trees, shrubs, and aquatics were installed here. And those are simply the icons with numbers on the plan. And where we're located now, one species planted is this red twig dogwood, a cornus. But then you also see the evergreen balsam fir, and there were some other, a spruce, a species of spruce, white spruce, this very tallest tree in the distance. So they were added to create vegetative diversity here at Maine Wetlands Bank.
Now, did you guys plant some of these other shrubs, or are these all volunteers?
A number of them are volunteers, such as we're seeing here. This looks like sweet
Yeah,
fern.
it does look like sweet fern. They know that plant.
Nice fragrant smell to it.
Yeah.
You know, sadly, I see
Oh, dear.
some purple loosestrife, an invasive species, and we'll need to try to control that. That's one of the requirements of the compensation site. There's not a lot here, so we may have a chance of taking care of it before it really becomes a problem.
Now, and I just wanted to ask you too, as I stepped kind of in a hole, there's definitely microtopography here, some little mounds, and then as we walked through the site, some areas that are higher and some areas that are lower. And I'm assuming that that was an intentional part of the site design?
Yes, indeed. To sort of create that lumpy character. It has a number of roles. One is just a very subtle changes in elevation to allow different types of plants to be installed and planted. Another is creating an irregular surface to detain flow across water across the site and promote flood storage. And even this boulder was just simply placed here. It was something that was hanging around just to add some, diversity to the site for habitat or whatever. And an example, I don't really see it here, but oftentimes we even plant dead snags to create a niche for different species, and there can be a requirement to have so much carbon on site as part of the soil. So those are some of the things that are factored into wetland restoration. Yes.
Put this on. So here we have swamp white oak, and if you guys are familiar with oak leaves, I don't know if you can tell, still holding on to some leaves from last year. And then there's alders here, but these are the native alders. Now the name is Alnus incana, and you will have seen that at the UNE created wetland site.
The swamp white oak is Quercus bicolor, and it's not a particularly common species in this part of Maine. Mm-hmm. It's more common in southern Maine and near the bog in Freiburg. But we chose to plant it here kind of as an experiment, if you will, but also just to add some vegetative diversity to, as you see, mostly the alder.
Alder definitely flourishes. They know this plant. I'm reading and learned quite a bit about Phragmites, and you can see there is a little bit on the site. So I asked Cole about it. What's the deal with the Phragmites? What is the deal with the Phragmites?
Well, the Phragmites was here before we started the wetland restoration, and I'm pretty confident that it came here when this site was being considered for development. And I guess that's an important thing to consider as we look across the site. Before we started this wetland restoration, there was 8 feet of fill on this property above our heads that was preload to squish the water out of the soil, it being wetland, to put a building on it, very similar to the ones we've seen earlier. So in the course of that pre-development, I think that's when the Phragmites was introduced. In addition, all this blonde grass that you see throughout the site is reed canary grass. It's considered to be an invasive species too, and it was actually promoted by the Soil Conservation Service as a seed to be used in wetter areas of disturbed sites. So that's just been kind of a problem that's existed for many years that persists now as a problematic species. But the Phragmites, when we undertook this work, it was of such a small amount that I simply decided that would not address it. I didn't see much of an opportunity for it to expand, and it, in a fashion, adds some diversity vegetatively. It's not a thick, dense thicket like you may see in other areas. So a few plants here and there, I just don't think were problematic. at this site, and fortunately it hasn't evolved. So this phase of wetland compensation at Maine Wetlands Bank was undertaken for the Portland Jetport and runway improvements they were doing there, and it resulted in about 10 acres of wetland impact. And a functional assessment that I performed of those wetlands that were impacted indicated they played a role in water quality improvement, specifically sediment toxicant detention, taking care of that runoff from the runway, and improving water quality before discharging into the Fore River of Portland. But another function of those wetlands was wildlife habitat. And here we have just an example. I can't begin to tell you what type of bird nest this is, but just like we saw the mallard earlier today, what we've done here at Maine Wetlands Bank provides wildlife habitat to offset the loss of that at the Portland Jetport.
And then my last question is just this property now, or these different parcels that you've showed us, are they now, who owns them, and is there an easement or something on them, or what, now that they are part of the Maine Wetlands Bank, will they be wetlands forever? How does that work?
That's a very good question. Yes, that's one of the requirements of wetland restoration when it's used for compensatory mitigation, requiring a permit. It is required that there be some form of conservation easement on the property so that in perpetuity it remains a wetland, is no longer developed. And as to who the steward is of that easement here, I don't recall at the time, but nonetheless, Maine Wetlands Bank, which totals approximately 65 acres in the upper headwaters of Long Creek watershed, will be here forever as a wetland community.